Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. I'm teaching a course on the German economy this term in Georgetown University, and just on Monday we're talking about the German industrial relations system and how rare strikes are in Germany, so it's interesting to experience the opposite in real life. This paper wants to take a rather broad perspective, a stylized fact view at the experience of 3 countries that were not part of the Eurozone for the initial part of the crisis. 2 of them are now members, the Baltic states. The Baltic states are quite interesting for 2 reasons. One is just their overall economic approach, which is very much liberal economy approach. And specifically, they're interesting for the Eurozone adjustment, because after a little bit of overindulgence from 2004 to 2008, they got into trouble. And within this trouble, including an overvaluation, they decided not to abandon the exchange rate pacts, not to go the external devaluation route, even though they had the theoretical option to do so, but to stick with the normal exchange rate regime and instead opt for an internal devaluation, triggering a quite spirited international debate at the time. And they succeeded by and large in that particular effort at some cost. So in terms of learning experiences for the remaining countries in the Eurozone that actually do struggle still with an overvaluation, even though the acute crisis is over, they provide a rather interesting example. Yet again, we have some dynamic. Which one should I? That one, excellent. So the overview is very straightforward, a very little bit on the history of currency boards, a little bit on the pros and cons as they have evolved over time, and then a focus on the Baltic states. The history is fairly straightforward. The history of currency boards divides into 2 phases. Classical currency boards were associated with the British colonial system. They were entirely trade-focused. The idea was to have easy trade between Britain and the colonies. They were run out of London and had virtually zero flexibility. By the time the colonies gained independence in the 50s and 60s, they largely abandoned the currency boards, partly because they were associated with colonialism, but also because activist monetary policy was fashionable at the time. So by the 1970s, the remaining set was very, very small, extremely small, open economies, many dependents. So think St. Helena, for example. This changed completely by early 1990 when Argentina adopted a currency board. Argentina was a very different country. It was much larger than the existing currency boards. And perhaps more importantly, it adopted the currency board not for reasons of current account stabilization or easy trade, but rather for credibility reasons. It adopted it after several hyperinflations and stalled stabilizations as a large-ditch attempt towards a complete dollarization of the economy. And the initial response was very positive. Inflation did decline. Argentina during the 1990s looks very, very different from the 1980s and 1970s. In the aftermath of this experience, currency boards gained again international appeal, and no less than 5 European countries adopted currency boards. This was Estonia first in 1992, Lithuania in 1994, followed by Bulgaria and Bosnia and Herzegovina after the conflict was over. And to those 4 de jure currency boards, one can add Latvia, which never formally adopted a currency board, but in practice behaved very similar to a currency board. Like the Argentinian case, these countries adopted currency boards largely for credibility reasons, either coming out of high inflation without a monetary track record, the Baltics, or in the Bulgaria case after a monetary track record that included inflation, and again in Bosnia and Herzegovina for political reasons as well. The exit from Argentina gained, again, a lot of attention to the system of currency boards, and the literature is dominated by Argentina, though it should be perhaps mentioned that Argentina is the only country, modern country, with a currency board that exited under financial duress, out of a quite significant overall number. And the question raised at that point, would the Baltic countries also exit the currency board, or would they persist with the peg? And that debate was never really gaining traction. The decision was to stay with it because there was a very clear exit strategy as well. Now, what's the theoretical case for and against these boards? The theoretical case in favor is very simple. In the short-term discipline, under a functioning currency board, central banks are prohibited from funding the government. That should limit monetary growth. That should create lower inflation. In the longer term, the ability to stick with the system would generate credibility to the monetary authority over time that might even extend if there was in the future a transition to more activist monetary policy. the case against, or at least the question against, involve around three issues. One, are currency boards actually associated with lower inflation? Two, if so, is that link causal? And three, if so, are the costs still too high to recommend currency boards? So three-step debate. On the first question, we looked at that together with Helge Berger, Anne-Marie Gulde, and Atish Ghosh in a very broad country data set, including all IMF members over almost 3 decades. And the answer is unambiguously yes. Inflation rates are considerably lower under currency boards, and it is not explained by hyperinflation. So even controlling for outliers, which of course much more likely under floating exchange rate regimes, there is a very strong negative association between currency boards and inflation. The question really is it causal? Right? And scholars like Nouriel Roubini and others have pointed out that perhaps this is more accidental. Right? That countries that have a strong commitment to running prudent monetary and fiscal policies are, one, more likely to have low inflation rates, are two, more likely to adopt fixed exchange rate regimes, and three, because they're actually committed to low inflation rates, are also more likely to be able to sustain pegs. Right? And speaking in Germany, obviously, the German experience under the Bretton Woods system, the snake and the tunnel, the floating exchange rate regime, the EMS, and now the Eurozone, amply illustrates that a fixed exchange rate is not necessary to have a good inflation track record over long time periods. Switzerland would also come to mind. So there clearly is something to be said about that notion. We can address that in two different ways. Right? One question to ask is if we actually restrict attention to those countries that have low monetary growth rates, that is, by revealed preference and outcomes, they fall into that group of countries that have prudent monetary policies. Does the inflation bonus of currency boards go away? And the answer is no. It is much smaller, but it does not go away. Right, one can also control for that in a more sort of complex econometric setting by endogenizing regime choice. The answer is again, controlling for this regime choice endogeneity issue reduces the effect of currency boards, but there's still something left. Even among countries that have low monetary growth rates, currency boards still do better. There's something extra, which suggests some sort of credibility effect that goes beyond the monetary discipline effect itself. And then the third question, which has gained a lot of attention recently, is the question of cost. Even if currency boards deliver ultimately on low inflation, is it worth it? And this comes up very clearly in the Baltic case. When Latvia, for example, under some international pressures decided to stick with an internal devaluation, the argument against that notion was very much that even if it were to work, it might land Latvia in a long period of underperformance, deflation-induced high unemployment, and that these costs would be too high. In general, the costs come in three different forms. Number one, a trend real exchange rate appreciation. The idea is that even if a currency board succeeds in stabilizing inflation, given that currency boards are anchored primarily by very tough anchor currencies, for example, the Deutscher for Estonia, the dollar for Lithuania, it is unlikely that the inflation rates in currency board countries will immediately decline to the same level as in the anchor currency, leading to trend appreciation over time, leading to overvaluation and then trade consequences. And one has to be a bit careful here in distinguishing between inflation and unit labor cost. Right? The countries that have adopted currency boards are also countries that tend to have faster productivity growth and therefore can afford a somewhat higher wage growth, will have somewhat higher non-traded inflation without really running into competitiveness problems necessarily. So looking at headline CPI inflation is not the right metric. Second argument is higher exposure to volatile capital flows. That pegged exchange rate will trigger excessive capital inflows, and that these in turn might then, under a sudden stop or reversal scenario, lead to distress in the domestic financial system. In particular, if the inflows are disintermediated through the banking system into the non-traded sector. At argument 3, and there's something Holger's meeting already mentioned, the lender of last resort. Right? Under classic currency boards, there is no lender of last resort. That is ruled out. Right? Now, in practice, that is not as relevant a constraint, and it's perhaps worth noting that the very notion of a lender of last resort was developed by Bajot in Lombard Street while the British system ran a gold standard. So the banking department was always there. And if you look at the Baltic states, that is also there. There are ways around the lender of last resort constraint. One, under modern systems, there's a constraint on the minimum reserve coverage, but not on the maximum. So countries can have extra reserves, which would allow an expansion of the money supply if needed in a crisis period. Countries can also set aside extra foreign reserve to allow for monetary expansion in crisis periods. And last but not least, and this is very relevant in the Baltic case, there may be foreign ownership of the banking system, in which case a lender of last resort function can be de facto outsourced to the parent banks abroad, or at least partly delegated there. So lender of last resort in the case of modern currency boards is not as a binding constraint. It is de facto there, even if it is formally ruled out. The evidence on these points is mixed. If you look at growth rate performance, it is actually over the entire period that we are looking at for 30 odd years, slightly higher under currency boards. But by 0.1%, it's trivial in magnitude, and it's likely because countries adopting currency boards, Argentina, Estonia, Latvia, do so after a period of crisis where the output is substantially below potential, so they tend to have a very fast growth immediately after the adoption, which gets reflected in average growth rate. So one shouldn't read too much into it, but at the same time, there is no clear evidence that there's a trend growth penalty associated with currency boards. So the issue is really volatility. In a very nice recent paper, Ghosh, Austria, and Qureshi look at this point. By looking at volatility across exchange rate regimes, they look at hard pegs in general, not just currency boards. And what they find is that if you look at traditional measures of crisis, they're actually less pronounced under hard pegs. So banking crisis, currency crisis, sovereign crisis, actually less pronounced. However, the very attempt, in some sense, to sidestep these type of crises finds its reflection in much greater incidence of growth collapses. And this again is quite relevant in the Baltic context, as we do indeed see a very sharp growth contraction in response to the crisis, but under an internal devaluation strategy that is actually maintaining the fixed exchange rate. So no currency crisis, but a growth collapse. So there is evidence certainly on the cost side. And the general idea that the average gains in better inflation performance come at the cost of both greater volatility, both on the nominal side and on the real side. Okay. Let me now turn to the Baltic cases in particular. One can divide the Baltic experience really in 4 different phases. The first one is adoption. The second one is a period until the early 2000s of very rapid convergence, the good years, so to speak. 2004 to 2008, then a move to overheating, leading to a crash, the adjustment to the crash, and then eventually recovery. And for 2 of these 3 states, exit in the Eurozone, and Lithuania aims to follow next year. We will see. Here just a brief background on the starting point. We see in all 3 cases, after the collapse of the ruble zone, the inflation rate going up to 1,000%. So that's the nominal instability prior to the adoption. And on the real side, collapses that range from 50% in Latvia to 40% in Lithuania and 35% in Estonia. Now, one should not read too much in this data. We know they have all sorts of statistical issues at the time of the transition that don't directly match into, certainly into welfare measures. But relative to the Central European countries, the stylized fact that comes out of it is the contraction in the Baltics was bigger, substantially bigger. So the Baltics were used to large shocks, even before the adoption. Now, if you think about this theoretically, it's not that clear what exchange rate regime is optimal in this situation. But on the one hand, high inflation argues for a peg to establish credibility, but on the other hand, very significant real shocks, term of trade changes, the entire transition process suggests that equilibrium relative prices will change quite substantially, which points more towards a flexible exchange rate regime. So theory didn't actually give a very good guidance at this point. And the decision of the Baltics ultimately came down to was a fairly strong commitment to a peg. Estonia was first adopting an orthodox currency board. Lithuania meandered a little bit for a couple of years before coming to the conclusion that they also wanted to adopt a currency board in 1994. And Latvia very rapidly also had a domestic political consensus on a fixed exchange rate, never de facto, never de jure adopted a currency board, but by 1994 was de facto running policies that were very, very similar. It's also worth noting that all 3 countries had banking crises. That these were not related to the currency board at this point. They were really legacy crises from the transition and the dissolution of the ruble zone. But the resolution had a connection to the currency boards, as the Baltic countries by and large did not bail out the banks. there's substantial consolidation and substantial privatization, which transferred ownership to particular Sweden and the other Nordic countries. So the Baltics ended up with a banking system that was largely owned by the Scandinavian countries, providing a lender of last resort support then in the future. So, first period after that was very positive, convergence. The Baltics stand out as countries that had a very significant structural reforms. On the EBRD indexes, they very rapidly catch up to the star performers even of Central Europe. By the mid-1990s, there's very little distinction. And in this framework, currency boards play one role among many, but supporting a very rapid convergence process, very rapid foreign direct investment, funding a large current account deficit, but without significant concerns at that point about sustainability. Inflation declined rapidly to the single digit, a little bit higher than in Germany and in the United States, so there was trend appreciation on the CPI-based real exchange rate, but very, very strong productivity growth meant unit labor cost-based measures initially did not really go out of line. Lithuania had a little bit of an exit debate after the initial stabilization, thinking, well, perhaps it's time to go to a more activist system between 1997 and 1999. After the Russian crisis illustrated the downside potentially of flexibility, there was, however, a commitment to stay with the currency board and use it as an exit strategy eventually to the Eurozone. So by the turn of the century, most assessments of the Baltic currency boards were quite positive, right? Emphasizing some vulnerabilities, but not overemphasizing them. Overall, it seemed to be a system that had developed quite well. This changed a bit after 2004, the actual accession. And what we see really is that the underlying productivity growth convergence continues, but on top of it, there is now a boom developing. And one might even call it a bubble. Real estate prices go up. There's a lot of inflows that gets now channeled into the non-traded sector. Construction goes up, real estate prices go up, the stock market goes up. And the current account dynamics change. They become much larger. In Latvia, they eventually breach 20%. And there's a very nice paper on it by Werner Reger about this transition from the productivity side to more the funding side on the current account. So vulnerabilities clearly emerge at this time, and the euro sector debt of both households and the non-traded sector goes up dramatically. And so we're moving into a situation of vulnerability, but not of crisis. Indeed, wages grow very rapidly. Double-digit rates, inflation grows at double-digit rates, and for the first time, unit labor cost-based productivity measures and real estate measures become quite worrisome. This all then, here's just a little sort of illustration of that features. Let's focus on the light blue line, which gives the investment rate in the Baltics. This is all compared to a set of Central European countries, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And we see that both there's much higher volatility in the Baltics, but also that the investment ratio goes out of line for a short time period, reflected then in a very, very high current account deficit for a couple of years. And the inflation rate, likewise, very good in the early years, actually substantially below the Central European rates, but then for a couple of years goes way above the Central European rates. And so this is a period where currency boards do not really deliver on the underlying promise of low inflation, but they do so while the countries very much play by the rules of the game. There's no violation of the currency board arrangement, but it still reflects in very high inflation rates. The peak comes by 2007, 2008, very large vulnerabilities on the external side, very little policy response, curiously enough. And a little bit on the prudential side, but no, for example, aggressive fiscal countermeasures as one might expect when the current account goes out of line so substantially. And so that's an interesting question that comes out of it. Why was there no response at this point in time? In particular, against the background of the Asian crisis, which only happened 10 years earlier, and that's very similar features. And Holger Schmieding mentioned that politicians learn and governments learn, but they don't necessarily learn from other countries' experiences, it seems. So in this case, the Asian crisis certainly has very strong implications that were repeated in some sense in the Baltics. So the crisis starts really with the Lehman collapse, sudden stop of capital flows, forcing an immediate adjustment, a very, very dramatic adjustment. This all happens before the IMF comes in the case of Latvia, right? So this is funding driven rather than policy driven at this point. The inflows does stop. The deficits start rising sharply Overall deficits look very good on the top line level, but at the end of the boom, estimates of the output gap are at plus 10%. Right? So the structural deficit is actually much worse. The headline deficit looks quite good. And this all now reverses in very, very short order. On the policy response side, Estonia and Lithuania decide to adjust without external assistance. Both continue the currency board and therefore opt to adjust to their overvaluation through an internal devaluation, trying to get relative prices down while maintaining the normal exchange rate. The standard approach adjusted by the IMF would in these cases be to pay a modest but phase in over time substantial fiscal adjustment with external support and a devaluation to support domestic demand as fiscal demand goes down. This is not the case in the Baltics. The Baltics have an extremely front-loaded adjustment, which is expenditure focused. The bottom table is for just 1 year, showing a net adjustment as percent of GDP of 11% for Latvia, right? So we're talking here about adjustments that are way larger than we would see in a standard adjustment process in a single year. Some additional assistance. The banking system, for example, did benefit from being owned externally. The parent banks were supportive, taking loads away from the domestic authorities. One country, Latvia, opted for an IMF support program in the end. Latvia was the one country that went most above trend and therefore had the most adjustment to do. But even that adjustment program with the IMF was unusual in that the IMF had to be convinced to go for an internal devaluation and a very strong front-loaded adjustment. So that debate happened in the fall of 2008. In the end, the IMF went along and in the ex-post assessment attributed this decision to the very strong ownership by the Latvian government and politicians more generally of the program. Right? Which was something, of course, that Stan Fischer, for example, in his assessment of the Asian crisis, sort of lamented the absence of strong ownership. The response is quite straightforward. Fears of a prolonged L-shaped recovery program were not realized. It was a very, very sharp decline in growth. It's a by far largest decline within Europe, but also a very, very rapid recovery. So V-shaped, if you ever want to see V-shaped, that's a V-shaped recovery. So the crisis was relatively short-lived. In the longer-term perspective, two graphs. The left one shows the Baltic real GDP in local currency and demonstrates the extremely rapid growth preceding the crisis, then in absolute terms, very dramatic decline and recovery. But clearly where one sets the benchmark here is quite important, right? Even at the peak of the crisis, real GDP only fell back to the mid-2000 level, which made the adjustment arguably quite easy. And on the unemployment side, we likewise see the reverse V recovery, but unemployment remains higher than it was before, and that is one argument on the skeptical side. And on the current account deficit, we likewise see the dramatic adjustment that Holger Schmieding also mentioned. Within 2 years, the current account went from Latvia from minus 20% to significantly positive. So an extreme adjustment, initially driven by demand contraction, not policy, but then later on also supported by realized depreciation of the real exchange rate. And this depreciation of the real exchange rate, which of course is at the core of the internal devaluation strategy, did not take place in the form of a wage reduction, which is where the debate primarily has been focused, but took place to a large extent, as Blanchard, Griffiths, and Cruz point out in a nice paper, to a large extent took place through productivity growth. And so sharp rebound in productivity actually reduced the unit labor cost exchange rate, avoiding some of the need to sustain normal wage cuts. Okay, so what are the lessons? First, the rules of the game were actually played by the Baltics for 20 years, so hard pegs are feasible. And 20 years is a very long timeline for modern fixed exchange rate systems and did generate credibility. That said, the monetary discipline did not prevent the boom-bust period in 2004 to 2008. It did come accompanied for the most with a fiscal conservative status. But there's an argument that pegged exchange rate may actually lead to more fiscal expansion because they postpone the day of reckoning But the day of reckoning only comes when the exchange rate regime collapses, and therefore there might actually be an incentive to overdo the fiscal expansion. That's certainly not the case in the Baltics. The Baltics remain at the very bottom end of the debt-to-GDP ratio. In Europe, as a matter of fact, Estonia is the lowest debt-to-GDP ratio countries. The stability framework did not translate into low real volatility. However, once the crisis erupted, the Baltics adjusted in the traditional way. They did not surrender the exchange rate regime, so in contrast to Argentina. Rather, they redoubled down on their commitment, and in the end, succeeded. Three questions or issues, I think, come out of this. One is the overlap between the Asian and the Baltic crisis. Right? We do see very high similarities between these two arrangements. Both fixed exchange rates for countries that are used to good performance have seen some current account deficits and see a worsening of the current account deficit that translates into a non-traded boom, ultimately leading to tears and decline. Right? So that lesson was not relearned. There was no fiscal adjustment in the Baltics sufficient in the 2004 to 2008 period to really dial down the overheating. Second question, under what conditions do internal devaluations work? This is very relevant, obviously, for the adjustment within the Eurozone itself. The primary consensus here has been that the Baltics are special. I think that's a little bit overstated. They're certainly special in a number of senses. One is that the overvaluation happened within 2 years. And so it's sort of an easy come, easy go argument, having a 40% real wage increase in 2 years followed by an equal decline in the third year still leaves you as well off as 3 years ago. So it was not really deeply embedded in some sense in the expectation yet. Also a very highly open economy makes it arguably easier to adjust as a larger fraction of all employees depend on the external competitiveness of the economy. That said, the feature that the adjustment ultimately took place through productivity to a large extent rather than through wages is, I think, a quite relevant lesson to be drawn in light of the fact that there are arguably quite significant productivity gains available in some of the countries in Southern Europe that are still struggling to adjust the real exchange rate. Third question linked to that, what can we learn from the Baltics for other countries? Again, there's a tendency in the literature to talk about Baltic exceptionalism. That these are very small open economies with an outstanding political commitment to remaining independent and to doing the tough decisions that are required, and that therefore these lessons are not easily transferable to other countries that are larger and have different political dynamics. I think that's true to some extent, but on the other hand, saying that the Baltics are exceptional is sort of the equivalent of having a country fixed effect in a regression. Right? It has to be the starting point of the analysis, not the final point. One has to ask why do some countries manage to do these tough decisions and others do not? And generally speaking, if we look at the argument of small open economies that are recently independent, we of course see quite a few of them. Right? All the successor republics of Yugoslavia and all the successor republics of the Soviet Union, or at least many of them, fall into that group. Not all have the same track record over time, so it's not a sufficient explanation in certainly. And so finally, conclusion. One, credibility. Yes, currency boards can deliver credibility. The Baltics overall, even with the 2004-2008 boom, have delivered lower inflation rates than many other Central European countries that had more flexibility. Secondly, no autopilot. There has to be continued close attention to these vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities are highly associated with packed exchange rate regimes in Asia and now again in the Baltics. And so it requires constant vigilance and particularly on the fiscal policy side, willingness to counteract these overboom periods. And certainly what one might call the dental lesson, it's much easier to avoid vulnerabilities than to deal with their aftermath. So stepping in early is the right policy there. And it's again on the fiscal policy side that one could fault the Baltics, if at all. But overall, a quite successful experience that for 2 of the 3 countries has now led to Eurozone membership, and the last one is trying to join next year. Thank you very much.